Greetings. This lecture is on stakeholder theory and specifically addressing stakeholder theory and how it fits into the concept of corporate social responsibility. We're going to compare and contrast sort of Milton Friedman's view of shareholder primacy and how that relates to Edward Freeman's idea that stakeholders and addressing issues of stakeholders is really an imperative for business success. The next few slides will be refreshing you on ethical decision making and then getting into the discussion about stakeholders versus shareholders and who's more important. One of the key principles of stakeholder theory is that when we are doing business, we don't stand in isolation from other companies, other constituents, and customers or suppliers. And in fact, business is about all the relationships that we engage in, some with customers, some with suppliers, some with peer institutions, some with joint ventures. Business is about building relationships, whether it's a relationship with a customer or a supplier or a relationship with our employees. So part of the job of the manager is to focus on which relationships are important and which ones need to be nurtured as much as is possible and as is feasible. The goal and the assumption behind stakeholder theory is that when we make value for all of our stakeholders, and it doesn't mean that we give away the farm, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about helping to create value for everybody, a win-win agreement, if you will. When we can do this, when it is feasible, the goal here is we should be looking towards how we can support others. Also, people can and do accept responsibility for the consequences of their actions. So it's really important that we take ownership of our own failings and take credit where credit is due for things that we do right. But clearly, when we recognize that we've had an impact on somebody, we need to address that. We need to make sure that we're taking care of those constituents that we may have hurt. Whether it was purposely or not, we still have a duty, if you will, to make sure that we handle those sorts of issues. So as we think about duty and we think about relationships, and we think about taking ownership of the impact that we have on others, particularly in the context of stakeholders, you can see why it's really important that we think about ethics and ethics within the relationships of the concept of corporate social responsibility and giving back to others. So, as the question asks, who is a stakeholder? And basically, it's really anybody who can affect the organization in some way or another, or can be affected by the actions of the organization. So whether or not somebody has an influence on you as the corporation, or whether you do something that influences part of society, it's a big giant Venn diagram, if you can think of it in any other way. Anybody that you do business with or you have a relationship with at one level or another is considered a stakeholder. Now, some stakeholders are more important than others, and we'll get into some of those nuances in a bit, but it's really important to recognize that stakeholders vary and are wide in terms of their influence on you and vice versa, and it's not a narrow group of people are the only ones you should be paying attention to. And for example, only your shareholders, because if we did everything that just our shareholders wanted, that may create problems with the relationships we have with so many other organizations and may actually hurt us in the long run. So, just to refresh you on the ethical decision-making process, remember we talked about this 8-step process. How do we identify our issues and then ultimately choose an action and monitor those outcomes? And in the midst of that is the impact on the stakeholder. Who has an interest, what is each person's motivations, and how much power does each stakeholder hold? And this is a big part of the ethical decision-making process, is not assuming that every stakeholder is equally weighted. Some are more important, some have greater interests, some have more power. That's not to say that we don't care and don't want to focus on shareholder issues. They're important. They're essential, actually, but they're not the only shareholder. They're the only stakeholder, rather. It's really important that we recognize if we're going to make an impact and we're going to make a decision, it's going to have an impact on the stakeholders at some level or another. So what benefits do they get from it? What harms do they get from it? Is it right? Is it wrong? Are we hurting somebody? The goal here is that we want to make sure we're assessing fairly and accurately what the impact is of our actions on all the stakeholders. So we begin with the shareholder view of the firm, and in the words of Milton Friedman. He says, and here's a couple of really good quotes from him. Number one, so the question is, do corporate executives, provided they stay within the law, have responsibilities in their business activities other than to make as much money for their stockholders as possible? And my answer to that is no, they do not. So again, Milton Friedman's argument is, we don't have any other responsibility at all whatsoever except making profit. That's the only thing we focus on. And it's a very narrow view, because we have to recognize that if our only focus is on making profit and not thinking about what impact our actions have on others, while in the short term we may do very well financially, in the long term this may hurt us. And we'll talk about issues of externalities and some of those challenges that Milton Friedman never really thought about. And understandable, because it wasn't a big issue when we were the big behemoth in the industry, where we had no natural competition, if you will, after World War II. We were the it. We were the ones that had, that had free reign in the business market. So, again, when Friedman was doing his best work, that was a way long time ago when we were the dominant industry. We were the dominant country in terms of the economy. But it doesn't work that way anymore. Too many people have power that, we recognize if we screw somebody over, it's going to end up hurting people in the long run. Another quote that he has, the most important single central facet about a free market is that no exchange takes place unless both parties benefit. This, I agree with Milton Friedman. We should make sure that when we're creating an exchange, whatever that exchange is, for all stakeholders, that no exchange will take place unless we both feel there's a win-win attached to that. Believe that, hands down. Another quote by Milton Friedman. What kind of society isn't structured on greed? The problem of social organization is how to set up an arrangement under which greed will do the least harm. Capitalism is a kind of a system. So, there's some degree of realism to this, but is greed really what he's talking about? Or, because if we think about virtues, right? Wanting to be successful is one thing. Being greedy is something entirely different. And just because people might naturally be greedy doesn't mean that's the right thing to do. Doesn't mean that we should acknowledge that's the only way to be. So we'll talk a little bit about this idea of greed, but greed is not a good thing. As much as Gordon Gekko and Wall Street would like to tell you that, greed is not good. Greed is the thing that ends up driving people to behave in ways that are inappropriate or illegal, and that can become a big issue and a challenge for us. So in the 1970s, as it says here, here's what Friedman argued, and most people sort of begin and end with this section of this quote. There's one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits. And by definition, that's fine. The way people interpret it, though, is it means we're not supposed to do anything else and shouldn't do anything else because it would hurt profits, not help it. And the argument that Friedman would make, Edward Friedman, as we'll get to in a few moments, is that not all activities are equally going to impact on profits. And in fact, we could engage in all sorts of activities that will have an increase in profit, and it's not always direct, but it may be indirect. So we have to think not just in the short term, but also the long term. We have to think sort of broadly about what is going to benefit us and help to increase our profits. Not all things are in the short haul going to draw in profits as much as they might have a benefit for us in the long haul. But here's the challenge. Most people sort of begin and end here and say, well, that means we shouldn't do corporate social responsibility. We shouldn't engage in investing in our local communities and things like that. His argument is, only focus on profits and that's it. But people forget sort of the second half of that sentence and that quote, which is, as long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud, which means we don't lie, we don't steal, we don't behave unethically, we make sure that we have free and open competition. And given that, that makes sense. But the problem is people have a very narrow interpretation of Friedman and believe that all he cares about, or all he really cared about, was shareholder value and that's it. from a narrow perspective, you can see how that would be an easy interpretation. But stakeholder evaluation, in the end, does make money for shareholders. They're not mutually exclusive, and a lot of people interpret it as mutually exclusive, and I think to some extent even Milton Friedman believed that they would be mutually exclusive, but as we can see in a multitude of different situations, they're not. We'll talk a little bit about Tesla. And some issues around Tesla. I think you'll find it sort of fascinating to think about the fact that they gave up patents and their profits and their stock prices went up. So interesting to see how people responded to their decision to decrease their patents, to not follow up on patents and patent lawsuits, and to simply walk away from them because they believe that they want free and an open market and an open exchange of information, and it actually benefited their stockholders in the long haul, not in the short, and even in the short haul. So it's interesting to think, Friedman would probably argue that we wouldn't want to do something like that because it could hurt stockholders, but in fact it didn't hurt stockholders at all. So we'll investigate that a little bit in class. So here are the basic assumptions of the shareholder view of the firm, the assumptions around Milton Friedman's ideals and how his ideals are interpreted. That people vote with their dollars, that pursuing our own self-interest is the best thing that we can do for society. Now, there's a difference between self-interest and greed. The assumption around the shareholder view is self-interest is okay, but when does self-interest become greed? And so I think that was some of the challenges that I think even Alan Greenspan had. He really underestimated the amount of self-interest, i.e. greed, that people would engage in. Hence, we ended up with the financial collapse that we had in the late 2000s. He really underestimated the extent to which people would engage in self-interest. And if people can't self-monitor, who else is going to monitor that other than the government, in that situation? So, the other argument from the shareholder view of the firm is that government should stay out of markets. Again, the assumption is that people are smart enough to self-monitor, right? That they're smart enough to not engage in high, disruptive, unvirtuous levels of self-interest. But we know that's not true. That's the challenge that we have. People will engage in extreme examples of self-interest to take care of themselves only and not think about what impact their actions have on others, but also for their own company in the long haul. Lastly, Friedman's argument, as part of that shareholder view of the firm, is that social responsibility is the responsibility of individuals, not corporations. And he would not see corporations necessarily as a person, so I'm not sure he would agree with the corporate personhood ideal. But regardless, if corporations are considered an entity and they are given rights and comforts, sometimes even equivalent to that which we would guarantee and give to individuals. For example, the ability to give unlimited money to campaigns. They're not voting, but the corporation still has more of a voice than individual voters. So in that circumstance, he doesn't believe that corporations should have the right and the obligation to engage in corporate social responsibility. The interesting thing that we'll see in a little bit is that corporate social responsibility isn't about altruism and giving away money for the sake of giving away money. That's a small aspect of it, don't get me wrong. Corporate social responsibility does include a small aspect of giving for the sake of giving. A, because it feels good. B, because it gives us a tax benefit. So, this is not let's call a spade, right? People aren't going to give money away just for the sake of giving the money away. It's rare that someone gives it away with no thought to the consequences of it in terms of tax implications or things like that. People give because they understand giving is the right thing to do. But the challenge is that we can engage in corporate social responsibility that also benefits our strategic landscape. And in which case then, Milton Friedman would probably agree with this. And as we'll talk a little bit about this when we think about Porter and this idea of strategic philanthropy. Other critiques of Friedman, aside from those that I've sort of inserted in this discussion already and under those assumptions, is that Friedman really did ignore externalities. He really did not think about what the long-term impact was on many behaviors. And Stiglitz, who is another Nobel Prize-winning economist, basically argues whenever there are externalities, where the actions of an individual have impact on others, and it's an unintended impact, right? I didn't pay for that. I didn't expect to get it, but it becomes an impact on me nonetheless. What you didn't directly affect me, but it indirectly affects me. And in those circumstances, when there are externalities, markets just don't work well. And the great examples of this are how we use pesticides because we think that's a great thing for our crops, but what we forget is the impact is on the bees. It's killing bees, and we need bees for pollination. So we're killing insects that are harmful, but are also killing the insects that are beneficial. It was unplanned, it was unintended, but that's an externality that when we think about corporate social responsibility and our obligations to our community, that's something we have to think about. Excuse me. Excuse me again. Factory farming and the use of antibiotics, also a big issue. We think we're helping ourselves because we have harmful bacteria, but what we don't realize is using large amounts of antibiotics are more problematic for us than one would think. So really what Friedman argues for is a real short-term focus over a long-term focus because he really ignores externalities. And so in the short run, if this is going to make me money, that's great. But what he ignores is sort of the shadow that our actions cast, the long-term implications of what we've been doing. So the next couple slides sort of look at some traditional ways of thinking about the organization and its stakeholders. And if you look at this slide here, at the top of the pyramid, which seems to be the traditional, top of the mountain, right? The shareholders, they're the ones that everybody bows to, that they're the ones that we have a responsibility to. Absolutely, we do. But are they more or less important than the employees who do the work on a day-to-day basis? If we don't have employees that we value and are doing good work, the shareholders have nothing, right? I mean, it's not like any one is more important than the other. They're important for different reasons. And the problem is when we only assume that what shareholders need and want are the only things that matter, we're doing this at the expense of our other stakeholders. So, and the other thing too, when we're only thinking about the corporation even in itself, we forget that there's the impact of customers and the community and the media and the government on the things that we do. And this model assumes that they affect us, but that we don't affect them. And that's not true. It's a reciprocal relationship, as we know. And here's a different view. In this view, the shareholders are at the middle. They're the ones that we sort of nurture and protect. And management's job is to huddle around them to keep them protected. And the rest of us out here, and the employees, the government, the customers, that we're all putting this undue influence, and it's management's job to make sure that they're protecting the shareholder interest. Again, it's an inward focus ideal, and it doesn't really honor the fact that we're in a lot of embedded relationships with all sorts of different folks, and each one of those relationships are going to have an impact. And if we don't treat someone well in the short run, in the long run, they're going to come back to screw us. We know this. It's human nature, right? One of the things I want to point out, because if you take any time to listen to Milton Friedman, if you listen to any interviews with him, particularly one that I have in mind is an interview that he had with Phil Donahue a number of years ago. And in that interview, he talked a lot about socialism, and that socialism was bad. And there's a big difference between the idea of being socially conscious and socialism. He uses those terms interchangeably as if socialism is social consciousness, and that's not the case. Socialism, as you should know, is an economic theory. It's the way that we manage the means of production, where a lot of stuff is sort of collectively managed through government ownership, things that seem to make sense, right? Things that should be centralized, like healthcare and things like that, and then they distribute the goods out in a fair way. And there are a number of socialist governments out there, mildly socialist, not talking big C communist, because that's about as socialist as you get, but we're talking about small S socialism, like some of the Scandinavian countries. They have socialized medicine and things like that, and it works quite well. Same thing for Canada. Socialized medicine works extraordinarily well and some levels, and it has its challenges in others. But socialism is about a means of managing production. Social consciousness is not about that. It's not about managing the means of production or having government control over everything. Social conscience means having a sensitivity towards things going on in society and recognizing the impact that you have on those things, and not to be looking at it in a cold and callous way. To have a social conscience recognizes that what we do has an impact, and that, you know, saying you're sorry is a big part of owning that it's important to recognize when you have an impact on things, as we talked about earlier. So to further illustrate the benefits of social consciousness, let's look at things like social conscious funds versus traditional funds. And as a rule, social conscious funds tend to perform certainly on par. At times they can exceed, but at least on par or low, or have a very small lag behind traditional funds. Now, to Milton Friedman's credit, in the years past, again, when we were the only business in town, it didn't matter if you were socially conscious because there was no competition. But now the competition is much more intense, that there truly is a battle, you know, for primacy, you know, in industries. We recognize that there has become a market for businesses that engage in socially conscious behaviors, really, which is really important. So, you know, the next couple of quotes here from Shaheen Pasha and from the Wealthfront blog, both are getting at how these social conscious funds are doing quite well nowadays. I can tell you that my social conscious fund in my TIAA CREF does, you know, at pace, on par with the rest of my investments, and on occasion will outpace them. Not always, but on occasion. So it's really nice to see that social consciousness does pay. I can imagine in Friedman's day it didn't pay because there was no competition, so why bother? Why care about those extra things? You don't need to do it. But now in this day and age, it is an imperative. We have to do it. There's no getting around it. And this quote is kind of interesting too, because social conscious funds can outperform their competition over the long term. And here's a quote from Sarah Fein, basically saying, the research team found that sustainable organizations outperform their competitors over the long term in 3 particular sectors, where customers are individual consumers. So individuals do speak with their money. They vote with their money. They make it really clear what they like and what they don't like and how they spend their money. The second area, where companies compete on the basis of brands and reputations, so good reputations. If you know that your reputation is going to be hurt by engaging in bad business practices, then you are more conscious about doing things the right way, however you define the right way, in an ethical manner. And in sectors where products significantly depend on extracting large amounts of natural resources. So, you know, in the oil industry, in the steel industry, in mining, and anything along that area, you know, when we know that we're going to have an impact on natural resources, the more conscientious we can be, the more socially conscious we can be around these things, the better off our organization is, and the more high performing those stocks are. As he says here, in these sectors, building a culture of sustainability is probably going to pay off more. So going to the lecture that you'll get in a little bit on sustainability, you can see how when we focus on sustainability in the long haul, this does benefit companies as a means of showing social consciousness. So let me bring you back to this ideal of what we call the standard stakeholder map. You know, and we looked at some variations of them, you know, in a few slides ago, but basically in both of those, the firm, you know, and the firm's leadership is sort of at the middle. And then, you know, all these other stakeholders are out there. The shareholders are considered a stakeholder, the customers, employees, executives, suppliers, communities, et cetera, et cetera. All these things, and you can see, as a rule, except for, I think, there probably is a mistake on the executives and the shareholders. Clearly there's an interactional effect there. Those arrows should go both ways. But That's the standard stakeholder map, the idea that the firm's in the middle and the rest of the stakeholders are out there. But how about if we change that focus? How about if we think about it in a different way? And that's what we'll see on the next slide. In this slide, what Friedman is arguing is that corporations aren't only ones at the center of the universe, that there could be a whole lot of different ways that we can think about who are the key stakeholders, who are the most important stakeholders to the company. And here's one variation on that, that the employees can and should be at the middle, that if we ensure that our employees are able to do their job in a safe and harmonious way, this is going to have an impact on customers, on executives, on shareholders, on shareholder value. And I'm sure you can think of companies that make that claim. We talked about Southwest Airlines quite a bit and how employees are truly their most important asset, and they truly believe that if an employee is happy, then and they can do their job well, they have the support to do their job well, this has a positive impact on all of these relationships in the organization. So this could be a great example of the stakeholder map for Southwest Airlines. Not every company shares that, but the goal of what I'm trying to say here is, and what Friedman's trying to say is, stakeholders are going to vary in importance, and it really depends on the context. It depends on the context of, who has the most at stake, and how are we arranged and organized in such a way that, for the purpose of our business, where are we going to have our biggest problem if we have a leakage or a breakage in the way that we do our business and the flow of work. And so none of these maps should be written in stone that there's only one way to think about the relationships and these complex relationships that we're engaged in. And how we set those priorities is going to differ depending on the lens that we use. So this complex stakeholder map gives you a good idea of the intensity of the relationships that we engage in. And for us to only look at shareholders, and that would be basically in that inner ring on the left-hand side, to the left of where it says the firm, you see Class A stockholders, Class B stockholders, bondholders, and banks. All right, these are the people that helped us with financing, right? And if those are the only ones we care about, look at the wide variety of other groups that we're ignoring, that our actions are going to have perhaps a negative impact on. And so I think this illustration really argues that you can't just focus on one group. That's not to say that they don't have the most at risk, and they probably do. But there are so many others that are impacted by your behaviors that it's essential that you make sure you're thinking about all of them in the totality of the factors to consider when you're making your decision. And given our initial lectures on the complexity of making these kinds of decisions, you can understand that this is not an easy task, right? Our brains are very limited in the way that we can make these decisions. And so it is a challenge to think about it. But if we approach it from a positive point of view, as opposed to an adversarial point of view, you gain more benefits because you're relieving some of the stressors that happen in your head when you're making it more adversarial. And it makes it a lot easier to make these relationships work. In the end, I think both Friedman and Friedman would agree that it's really not technically a debate, particularly if you start thinking about externalities and you account for externalities and you account for the fact that when stakeholders have value, everybody wins. It is a win-win. And the quote here I really appreciate, so I'm just going to rehash it here. The primary responsibility of an executive is to create as much value as possible for stakeholders, because that is how you create as much value for shareholders. When you screw over your stakeholders, as I'm editorializing here, when you screw over your stakeholders, they're going to come back to bite you. We know this. This is sort of natural human tendencies. People seek revenge. So you can't continue to screw somebody over and not expect it eventually to hurt you. So if your goal is to keep it adversarial, just to extract what you can in the short haul, in the long haul, you're not acting in a sustainable and fair way for the organization. So going back to the quote, where there is a conflict between stakeholders and shareholders, executives have to rethink the problem so that the interests all go together. In essence, what he's arguing for is a win-win agreement. And so as you get into your next class, in the negotiations class with Dr. Love, as many of you will be moving on to, that's the way to think about things, that it's about all the stakeholders. It's not just about what the shareholders want, and it's not a zero-sum game. It's not a win-lose. No stakeholder interest stands alone. Where interest conflict, the job of the manager is to figure out how to redefine things so to create more value for both without resorting to trade-offs or fraud or deception, which is that harken back to the quote from Milton Friedman. The goal, Friedman would argue, we're only worried about profit. And Friedman says, yes, we worry about profit, but we do it not by screwing over all of our stakeholders and only focusing on shareholders. We do it by making sure all the stakeholders' interests are met, and we do it to find value for everybody, to make it a win-win, and we don't do it by making trade-offs that are going to hurt ourselves and others. Because again, as Friedman says, we want to make sure both people are in an agreement and in an arrangement that actually matters, that everybody gets something out of it. So we don't engage in fraud, we don't engage in deception, we don't do things illegally or unethically, we do things fairly and freely and above board. And in the end, we can all win. One of the things that people have to get used to, managers in particular, is to use moral language as they make discussions. And what I mean by moral language is truly thinking about the ethical implications of what they do in pretty much every decision that they make. Managers always think about things in terms of financials or in terms of strategy, but they tend to ignore the moral dimensions. Even if they see them, they recognize them, they're honoring them, but they don't use the words. They don't say them out loud. And if you don't say those words out loud, if you don't say, what's the right thing to do? What's the ethical thing to do? You'll find that people will start to not use those words anymore. And instead of exercising sort of our moral muscle, it'll tend to atrophy. So it's important for us as we analyze things and we use the language of business, we use the language of financials, we use the language of strategy, that we also need to use the language of ethics. All right. So the goal here is, even if we are behaving morally, we should also talk about it and not just let it be assumed. Let's talk about the pink elephant in the room, if you will. Acknowledge that ethical issues and ethical considerations are a huge part of this. And that's how you start to develop your ethical culture. That's how it becomes stronger and more ingrained, when it becomes part of the language and the symbols and the things that we use, as we talked about culture a while ago. So this slide is a nice comparison of this idea of stakeholder theory versus business and shareholder primacy. And the way this is set up is it's saying, if something is considered good for ethics and it's considered bad for business, that is the traditional view of, say, corporate social responsibility. The traditional view, particularly under Milton Friedman, is that it might be good ethically to do something, but it's not always good for business if we engage in corporate social responsibility. And again, if the assumption is that corporate social responsibility is only about giving altruistically, you can absolutely see that that's not a good decision. But when you're giving in a way that's more strategic, as we'll address in a bit, that actually is much better for business. But the old traditional view, if you will, of corporate social responsibility says, this is all about giving, and we're supposed to give and give and give. Yeah, that could be considered as bad for business, absolutely. Something that's bad ethically and bad for business, well, those are nihilists, and I think we can probably just sort of, wink, wink, nod, nod, and ignore them. But let's go over to that bottom left there in that 2x2. Friedman's interpretations tend to be argued that, if you're going to do something, it better be good for business, and it is not always going to be ethical. Because his argument is we shouldn't engage in CSR. We don't need to behave, necessarily, engage in sort of this detailed ethical analysis. The focus should be on, profits and profits for shareholders, and nothing else matters. Problem is, if we're only limited to that view, we might engage in things that are illegal, and that could put us into a lot of danger. So Friedman-esque interpretations, not necessarily Friedman's views, but Friedman-esque interpretations would be, if it's good for business, it typically is not always a good ethical thing to do, necessarily. The bottom line here with stakeholder theory is that it's good for business and it should be good for ethics. It's a win-win across the board. When we pay attention to all of our stakeholders, that's good for us ethically also. and we win for business, and we win for treating people fairly and appropriately. I like this idea of enlightened value maximization. And the idea of enlightened value maximization is that we need to be thinking about things really in terms of long-term implications. Going back to the point, previously about Friedman's focus has tended to be much more on the short term than the long term. And the problem is, if we only focus on the short term, we give people license to engage in unethical and sometimes illegal behaviors, because we tell them no matter what, you need to make money, and all that matters is what we do right now in this moment, in this quarter, and we forget about the impact that we have on long-term profitability and long-term reputational issues and things like that. So enlightened value maximization is really about thinking about the long term and making sure that we don't destroy our reputation in the process. So when we think about, stockholders more important than stakeholders, and how do we handle this situation, a lot of times it comes down to metrics. And the metrics are the ways that we utilize tools to know whether or not we had an impact, that something mattered. So metrics are a key part of how we understand our value, and your metrics can't just be limited to financial ones. We have to be thinking about broadly about what metrics are essential to us. And financials are important, yes. We saw the stuff about the social conscience funds, and those metrics are really important. But there's other issues too, the things that we can't put a dollar value on, which is our reputation. And it's really hard to put a dollar value on your reputation. It's hard to put a dollar value on a human life. We know what the actuarial tables would tell us, but clearly, telling somebody that you're only worth a couple of dollars, doesn't really flow too easily. So our goal in this whole idea for the keeping score is we need to ensure that we have useful metrics that we're using that are really related to what matters and what our purpose is in engaging on the behaviors that we're engaging in. Stakeholder value is important in that aspect. So we were addressing earlier about this issue of trade-offs, and do we sometimes have to make trade-offs? Yeah, sometimes we do. The goal is we always want it to be a win-win solution. We always want to try to find that. But as you'll know, as I'm sure you know, and as you will sort of explore even more, win-wins are not always the best solution and are not always feasible. When it's feasible, aim for it. When it's not feasible, clearly we have to think about trade-offs. And there are times when you're going to have to do that. The goal here is that we don't want to screw over any one particular stakeholder than another. So they don't want to get one group to get the short end of the stick all the time. So, I say, oh, well, shareholders win, environment loses every single time. That's going to create a problem because, again, because these are embedded relationships, when we start to create a tension in those embedded relationships, that's when that complex web of trust starts to fade and starts to break down. So I would argue that the best companies really do think about what the impact is on the stakeholders, that we're honest with them when we have to make a decision that may not benefit them the best, try to give them the best reasoning that we have, and then try our best not to hurt them in the future, that we will make sure that we're considering their issues in other contexts when we can and when it's appropriate. So what are some typical misinterpretations around this idea of stakeholder theory? Number one, the idea that stakeholder theory is only concerned about distributing our financial outputs, and therefore it has to be distributed equally amongst everybody. And then no, that's not necessarily true. It's not just about who gets how much, but about who has a voice, who can be heard. I mean, even if someone doesn't get a benefit, if they feel heard, there's a benefit in that. And so it's about making sure it's a fair process and that we have voice and concern for everybody involved. And when people's voices are heard, as I've said before, this is a win-win for everybody. I appreciate when I'm heard, even if I don't get what I want. If I really truly believe that someone heard me and considered what I had to say, again, that feels good for me. So stakeholder isn't just about the financial stuff, but it's also about the trust in the relationships and the way we manage that. The next one, are all stakeholders should be treated equally? Well, no, not at all. I mean, as I've said multiple times before, There are different risks for different stakeholders, different costs for different stakeholders, different contributions for different stakeholders. But we have to make sure we're accurately representing what those risks and costs and contributions are. You might say, well, it's the environment, so who cares? Well, there's a cost to that, not maybe in the short term, but clearly in the long term. And so we have to be considering all of those issues. The goal here is that when we think about the ranking and the importance of different stakeholders, that they're ranked based on what their contributions, costs, and risks are. And when we do that, it makes it an enormous amount easier for us to then consider what their issues and concerns are. And it also, how we rank and treat those stakeholders is really dependent on what our lens is. People with a rights and responsibility lens are much more focused on the individual and that individual's duties, and did they behave those duties appropriately. Alternatively, someone who's a reputation lens is much more concerned about behaving virtuously, or the relationship lens is concerned more about the community and ensuring that the community is treated fairly in that process. Another interpretation is the idea that stakeholder theory is socialism, and we've already had this discussion, right? Stakeholder theory is about building trusts and building trust within a free market economy. It's not about managing your economy through government regulations and government control. Stakeholder theory is not a form of socialism where you're giving away the farm. Stakeholder theory is about making sure that we build good, trusting relationships with others. The other thing is that stakeholder theory is about corporate social responsibility. Yes, it is at some level, but really what it's about is creating value for everybody in a very strong social structure, and it makes us recognize that when we have good social value, that also can affect our financial bottom line. And as we can see from those social conscience funds, they can have a very positive impact on our financial bottom line. So good behaviors affect our reputation. Our reputation then encourages our suppliers and our buyers and our customers and our employees to behave well and to do business with us. And so it's embedded. There's a very complex web of relationships. You can't just assume if you screw people over all the time that you're going to end up, ahead winning. It's not going to work that way.